that we have projected weakness as a nation on the world stage for the last couple of months. The failure to deploy HMS Dragon was regrettable. It is quite clear that Keir Starmer has severely annoyed the White House and Donald Trump in particular. And I suspect that your correspondent is right. I suspect that UK sensitivity over the Falklands is obviously preying on Donald Trump's mind at the moment. And perhaps he sees that as a weakness with Keir Starmer.
So weeks ago, we predicted that America's NATO allies, especially the UK, would come to regret their behavior throughout this Iran conflict for various reasons. And with that said, I now want to follow up on a story that we briefly mentioned a couple of weeks ago, but now is escalating a lot. And that has to do with Argentina and the Falkland Islands. That is right, folks. Here we go again. And I think it's important to understand what is fundamentally happening here, and that's that the sharks are smelling blood in the water. They're beginning to notice weakness, and they're taking advantage of it, because what has effectively now happened is now that many various countries around the world have noticed that America and NATO have basically fallen out because Trump has said, well, you don't help us, we're not going to help you. And by the way, countries like the UK and prime ministers like Keir Starmer have established themselves to be total paper tigers. You watch as the once mighty Royal Navy cannot even get a single destroyer working. It can't even produce fresh water. And as a result, many countries are now starting to eat Keir Starmer's lunch. It's very notable. They're not listening to his rhetoric about ceasefires and diplomacy and respecting that as strength. They're noticing it rightfully as what it is. That is weakness. And we've spoken before about how countries like Russia are now sailing their warships through the English Channel, basically as a big middle finger. You have Russian submarines spying on British infrastructure throughout the North Sea. And that is something that maybe historically Russia would not have the guts to do, especially if America would have stopped them from doing so. But understanding that America now has the stance towards Europe of, well, that's not our problem, that's your problem, you're noticing this begin to happen. And the arguments thus far that Europe, at least in its current state in 2026, and the UK especially, don't actually have the military capacity anymore to defend themselves because their armed forces have gone completely in the dumpster fire. This is, of course, what is happening. But maybe the less reported angle of this is that Argentina is now trying to do the same thing with the Falkland Islands. This is, of course, the small island chain off the coast of Argentina, which the Argentines call the Malvinas, which was the source of a conflict between Britain and Argentina back in the 1980s. Britain, of course, back then, when they had still something of a functional military, won that conflict. By the way, the Reagan administration, in the end, did provide support and back the UK in that conflict. But I hope maybe you can realize you're looking at a different chessboard in 2026. America's not so pro-UK anymore. And by the way, the British Navy, the British military, what the heck is going on there? Well, that is, of course, why the Argentine right-wing government currently in power is starting to smell weakness. They're threatening and trying to make diplomatic moves to pursue the re-annexation, or the annexation, I should say. They never had it, but the annexation of the Falkland Islands. And according to a recently leaked Pentagon report, it sounds like as a get back, as revenge against Keir Starmer, the Trump administration is looking to now formally take the diplomatic side of Argentina instead of the UK over the whole Falklands crisis issue. Now, historically, you might say that if Argentina tried to do anything with the Falklands, the answer by Britain should be very similar. Send your navy as you did in the 1980s and go and take it back. But oh, wait a minute. Have we noticed the UK doesn't really have a functional navy? They don't really have a military? Keir Starmer is very afraid to put his armed forces into any remote level of danger, although I don't think it's the issue that, oh, he's really just a peace-loving guy or he doesn't like war. No, he knows that his military has no capacity to actually fight. So this is, of course, again, the natural consequence of letting your country descend into weakness. Trump and others throughout the years have warned you about it, but quite interestingly, you're watching that ever since this news broke today, suddenly there's this new wave of patriotic fervor out of British people, including the liberal-leaning and left-wing ones. They're saying, the Falklands are ours. How dare Trump do this? How dare Argentina say this? Well, you know, where was this national pride for the last 40 years? And I'm glad to see it back, right? Like, I actually principally do not believe the Falklands belong to Argentina, but hopefully the UK realizes, especially being a tiny island that still marginally does have some overseas territory and empire, you could call it, that maybe, you know, you need a navy, maybe This idea that post-Cold War in the 21st century, countries will not anymore try to take advantage of Britain is ridiculous. And perhaps it'll be a wake-up call. I don't know. Nonetheless, let's get into this story here today. I want to explain the current Falkland situation. First, though, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. That is the best way to support our work, and it also ensures that you can stay up to date with all of the latest news and coverage. And that said, I think this all begins with the publicly stated words of the Pentagon, and then we'll explain for you the Falklands issue. But again, just to understand why this is all happening when it is now, it's not much of a mystery.
It's also worth saying, this should not be America's fight alone. We barely use the Strait of Hormuz as a country. Our energy doesn't flow through there, and we have plenty of energy. Just look at the new global Congo line, headed to Texas. A beautiful picture. Europe and Asia have benefited from our protection for decades, but the time for free riding is over. America and the free world deserve allies who are capable, who are loyal, and who understand that being an ally is not a one-way street. It's a two-way street. We are not counting on Europe, but they need the Strait of Hormuz much more than we do, and might want to start doing less talking and having less fancy conferences in Europe and get in a boat.
Yeah, so those were the words of the Pentagon this morning, but it's worth noting that this is not exactly new messaging from the Trump administration. We expect alliances to be a two-way street. Allies should be, first of all, militarily capable, Keir Starmer, as well as politically and diplomatically loyal. Once again, Keir Starmer. But what is new is that America might be doing something on the geopolitical chessboard about it. According to a new leaked memo this morning from the Pentagon, and if I were to guess this was an intentional leak, it sounds like the controlled leak that you put out there on purpose to make sure people know where you stand right now, is suggesting that America could withdraw its diplomatic support for European countries like the UK retaining their imperial possessions overseas, which is to say if countries like Britain and France, etc., have these overseas territories, America for the past several decades has been basically diplomatically backing up their territorial sovereignty over them at the UN and various other institutions. We may start to withdraw that and effectively say, no, we might take the side of the decolonization because, well, what's the point of us defending these old, archaic, almost European empires if the European empires don't also come to our support, which of course has major implications for the UK's historic claim over the Falkland Islands. Take a listen.
Leaked Pentagon email seems to outline potential punishments for those NATO countries who have not supported the United States or Israel in their war against Iran. One possibility that the United States might withdraw its support for Britain's sovereignty of the Falkland Islands.
The strategy over the Falklands is to try to unsettle the British government. But they won't do that because Britain's claim to the Falklands is extremely solid, both in historical terms, and it's absolutely 100% solid on grounds of national self-determination. The Falklanders, 99% of them, want to remain British.
Now, in fairness, that is completely true. The Falklands are British. Britain has a completely valid claim over them. And to be clear where I stand, I view the Falklands as being British. However, what happens to your territory when you cannot defend it? This is the vital question, and what America is currently saying right now is, well, this is the F around and find out statement. What is the UK gonna do if America withdraws their support for Britain having the Falklands? Historically, by the way, America was helping to veto Argentine claims at the UN saying that it should be ours, and so if they start going neutral, if America even votes alongside Argentina, or if Argentina just does something and America says, well, we're neutral in this conflict, right? It's not all war, right? It's not our war, so what's gonna happen next? Well, in order to understand that, I think it's key that we, first of all, just explain some of the history of the Falklands for the kids out there, or maybe people who forgot. So just for some historical context, and this is important so we can understand the issue, the Falklands are a small island chain off the coast of Argentina that are historic British territory. Now, basically, the British argument is that, well, there's no indigenous population on the island. It's been settled by British. It's entirely nowadays British people who live there. In every independence referendum, 99% of Falklanders say they want to remain British. It's our territory, right? It's ours. It belongs to us. But the Argentine argument is, well, look at the geography. It's right off the coast of Argentina. It's this like relic of colonialism or imperialism or whatever. And so really it should belong to us. Now, what happened in 1982 was that a right-wing junta government, which was in charge of Argentina, basically invaded the Falklands to make a statement, right? It was seen as like this nationalistic thing of, oh, you know, we're going to take the Falklands, it's ours, blah, blah, blah. And because, let's remember historical context here, right? Post-World War II, the latter half of the 20th century, we were watching decolonization efforts around the world. Britain, France, many of the old European empires were giving up their territories. It was widely assumed, at least by the Argentinians, that Britain would not do anything to stop or defend the Falklands, right? They were just going to allow that to keep falling because the latter half of that century was mostly, yes, decolonization efforts and surrendering. However, what the Argentines did not calculate was the fact that Britain at the time was ruled by a fairly right-wing prime minister. You might have heard her. Her name was Margaret Thatcher, who basically saw Argentina invade the Falklands and said, absolutely not. No, that's our territory. She, of course, made the decision at the time, which let's not forget, even in 1982, was controversial, right? It was not really known whether Britain would actually respond to this. So keep in mind, even in the 80s, even with Reagan in America, even with Thatcher in the UK, it still was sort of up in the air whether it was the right thing to defend the Falklands. She, of course, though, does send the British military, and effectively the last cool and great thing Britain ever did was kick Argentina out of the Falklands, reestablish their territorial control, and, hooray at the end of the day is sort of the last hurrah, yes, of the British Empire. Now, again, for all the reasons I listed, and because I'm not a leftist, right, I don't believe in, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, all that garbage, I stand with Britain 100% on the Falklands issue, but it's also worth noting that, if you're right-wing in Argentina, it's sort of seen as this nationalistic thing to want to take the Falklands for yourself. And then if you're right-wing in Britain, because you sort of idealize your old empire, it's also seen as patriotic to want to take the Falklands. Or retain the Falklands, I should say. So it is this complicated issue. Going now, though, to 2026, it's worth noting, okay, so back in 1982, initially the U.S. tried to figure out a diplomatic solution. When they, by the way, though, understood the U.K. was going to war, America provided a lot of key logistical and material support to the U.K., right? America backed the U.K. Obviously, as you can see nowadays, that might not be happening so much, okay? And it's also worth noting, too, that however much the British military had declined throughout the course of, post-World War II, it certainly was a lot stronger in 1982 than it is now. So it's this big question. Without American support, and with the British military being in the totally failed and awful, dismal state that it is today, if Argentina wanted to do something against the Falklands, would Britain respond? Because as you probably can figure out by now, we don't exactly have Margaret Thatcher in charge of the British government. So what's going to happen? Well, this is very interesting because in recent days, we've, of course, heard that report from the Pentagon, basically America shifting towards taking Argentina's side on the Falklands. Argentina, by the way, once again, shadows of history in some regards. I'm not saying he's anything like the juntas, but also important to point out, is now led by a right-wing government, right? Javier Milei. Chile, likewise, just elected right-wingers. There's a huge surge, largely backed by the Trump administration, of now right-wing governments across Latin America. And for understandable reasons, they take the Argentine side on this Falklands issue. So what would even happen if they made a coalition? We don't know. But we saw Javier Milei come out today and said the Malvinas, which is what the Argentinians call the Falkland Islands, were ours and always will be Argentine. So the Argentine government is now publicly coming out and saying, we believe that territory is ours. America is saying, it's not our war, it's not our problem, it's not in our national interest. So what's going to happen? Well, of course, this is what happens. First of all, let's just point out again, when you assert your weakness to the world, when you show that you're the paper tiger, right? Needless to say, if the UK looks strong right now, I don't think Russia would be sailing boats through the channel. I don't think Argentina would be talking all this trash and threatening to annex the Falkland Islands. But, you know, that is what happens. It is worth noting, however, in response to this news today, we've seen almost this universal uproar from the British media, from British politicians, even the left-wing ones, quite ironically, suddenly saying the Falklands are ours. Suddenly this patriotism that hasn't been there was awoken for whatever reason. But take a listen.
Are they our ally? Because we've had this perception in Britain, in Europe, since 1945, that the US has our best interests at heart, but I'm not sure the evidence bears that out. We are now dependent on them for oil and gas rather than Russia. They own a huge amount of our company.
Well, sorry, would you rather be dependent on Russia?
I would rather be self-sufficient, or at least have spread our bets a little bit more. 2 million people in the UK work directly for US companies, far more than any other country in Europe.
Well,
all that money goes, because all the profit goes straight back to America.
And
they own us.
The Prime Minister's spokesman made it very clear that sovereignty rests with the UK. The people of the Falkland Islands have voted over and over again overwhelmingly to remain a British sovereign territory.
Yeah, well, it is kind of funny to watch how this issue in particular has suddenly awoken a nationalistic pride in the British people, right? The Falklands are ours. Even the Prime Minister is saying that. You know, we have to be self-sufficient. We shouldn't be so reliant on America. Well, that's been what Trump's been telling you for a long time, right? It's sort of interesting how even when Trump antagonizes Europe, he's still kind of doing what's best for them, right? Because it is best for Europe if they actually build functional countries, right? They don't have militaries and economies that are effectively just being subsidized by the United States. But of course, to Keir Starmer, I have to ask the question, are the Falklands really yours, though, in your view? Okay, I've asserted I'm right-wing. I believe the Falklands belong to Britain. I don't buy this whole decolonization bullcrap, right? But it's worth noting you are a leftist. By the way, let's not forget one of the initial sore spots between Trump and Starmer over Iran actually had to do with Diego Garcia and some of the islands in the Indian Ocean that the UK was basically trying to decolonize. Why? Because, again, Keir Starmer's a leftist. Oh, we should hand it back to the native populations, blah, blah, blah. And Trump basically had to step in and overrule him and say, no, like, that's our joint military base. You can't just hand it over to Mauritius or whatever country I think that was supposed to belong to. Stop this decolonization woke bullcrap. No, we need it, right? We're not going to just, like, surrender our territories and our military bases. So the same question, honestly, rings true of the Falkland Islands. We'll find out here, right, whether or not Starmer would do anything besides words when it came to defending the Falklands. But I would point out, so as a result, suddenly you've seen this universal bipartisan consensus in the UK where everyone's coming out and saying, we're against Trump. The Falklands are British. So this is expectedly coming from the right-wing parties. The Tories are saying this. Reform is saying this. You have Nigel Farage coming out today and stating that the Falklands are and will always be British. Not surprising, the British right wing generally says, you know, so whatever empire we still have left, we have an interest in keeping. But you notice even left wing MPs are coming out and saying stuff like this. The Falklands are British. Sovereignty rests with the UK. Self-determination rests with the islanders. Even Piers Morgan, who is saying, if President Trump wants to take the Falklands away from Britain, then we must reclaim the United States. Perfect way to celebrate the 250th anniversary of American independence. King Charles can announce it to Congress next week, which, ha ha ha, funny tongue-in-cheek. But, you know, you wonder if Piers Morgan would express the same nationalistic sentiment toward the actual invasion happening towards his country, at his borders. But hey, you know what? If this is the wake-up call that Britain needs, I'm here for it, right? If on the 5D chess level, I understand and can comprehend why this is actually sort of a good thing for the UK when you think about it, because suddenly, yeah, you hear this now. They're becoming nationalistic. They're becoming patriotic. Oh, our empire must stand strong. Oh, really? Oh, really? So several decades of retreat and just like civilizational decay, you now want to reverse? Well, good for you, right? Round of applause there. Of course, it is still worth questioning, especially of the Starmer government, whether or not, despite them publicly taking the stance of the Falklands are ours, if they would actually do anything about it. And this is the question, right? Because Starmer likewise has said, oh, the Strait of Hormuz should be open, but what are you going to do about it? So if Argentina invaded the Falklands, if the U.S. withdrew its diplomatic and military and political support for British sovereignty over the Falkland Islands, what would Starmer actually do about it? And it's worth noting, even today in his statement about sovereignty or whatever, the labor officials here could not answer definitively whether the UK would have the capacity to repel an Argentine invasion of the Falklands, which tells you everything, right? Starmer, much like he is in Iran, because he doesn't have a military that's remotely functional, all he has here is words, even on the Falklands issue. Take a listen.
The issue, of course, is that if Donald Trump were to take this a step further and change the security arrangements in the South Atlantic Ocean, at the moment the UK and America work really, really closely together in protecting the Falkland Islands, then the question would be, could the UK manage to overturn an invasion from Argentina? Back in 1982, of course, Thatcher sent out our boats, and it was possible to defend the Falkland Islands, to keep the Falkland Islands. Could that happen in 2026? Well, very tellingly, that question was asked at Lobby this morning 3 times over to the Prime Minister's spokesperson. Could the UK defend the Falkland Islands if it came to it? Obviously, the Prime Minister's spokesman could not say yes. Look how long it took to send HMS Dragon out to where it needed to be. That's just one battleship. The UK naval forces have been hollowed out for so many years, decades really now, that it is not a dead certainty that the UK could defend the Falkland Islands in the way that it did in 1982.
Yeah, so that's certainly the typical Starmer answer, isn't it? You know, you issue this bold, strongly worded statement, and then when you're asked, okay, are you actually going to do anything about it? Could you do anything? Would you do anything? Well, we'll get back to you on that. Well, I think, honestly, the answer, I'm not really sure on this, let me be clear, but it seems like, at least as it currently stands, the answer is actually no. If they needed to, without, let's not forget, American support, I'm not sure the British Navy of 2026 could defend the Falklands like it did in 82, because they don't even have a destroyer that can produce fresh water, and you're expected to repel an invasion force halfway around the world. I'm not really sure, right? But, you know, this is kind of the sad consequence, as we've been saying, of, first of all, what happens when European countries, the UK included, have become delinquent in their defense over the past several decades, basically reliant on America. Oh, America will always have our back. We don't really need to defend the Falklands. America's got that for us. Oh, well, America's now saying no free rides. What happens next? Right? Like, you guys can't actually do. And then, of course, here's the other miscalculation I would argue that European leaders made. If you're going to be freeloading off of America, if you're going to be reliant on them, then at least go with them, right? Understand, you don't have the cards in that relationship. You don't have the leverage. If America says, we want to go to war in the Middle East, you're kind of obligated to follow because you're reliant on them. But if you're going to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do that, then America says, okay, we're not helping you anymore. Look at the situation it's caused for you. So it is what it is at this point. You know, not really unexpected. Again, this is what happens when other countries smell weakness. It is what it is. You know, to an extent, I almost sort of hope Argentina does it just as a sort of shock wake-up call, honestly. Hopefully they do it right before the next election, right? To get that loser Starmer out and sort of be this reality check for the UK and a lot of Europe that, hey, we actually need to have our own defense. You know, this idea post-Cold War especially that, oh, there's no enemies anymore, or America will always have our back. That's obviously just not true. It was never true, by the way. I mean, there's no reason self-interested from America why they should just subsidize Europe for basically no purpose. So, especially when Europe's not going to act in conjunction with America. So, you know, there you have it, right? This is, of course, what happens. And who could have seen it coming? Who could have possibly seen it coming? That when Starmer rebels against America and then shows how weak he actually is, Russia's eating his lunch, Argentina's eating his lunch. You know, is Ireland gonna start coming back to? I don't know, but we'll see. Anyways, that said, guys, let me know your thoughts. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you were new, and until next time, God bless and peace.